Welcome to Hey Chaplain. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. The Hey Chaplain podcast is a series of conversations, mostly with police officers, who say, "Hey Chaplain, I've got a story to tell and some hard-earned wisdom to share." The guests on Hey Chaplain come from all over, from the LAPD to Scotland Yard, from big cities to small town and rural agencies. They are sharing their stories so that you don't have to learn the hard way. And as a patrol chaplain here in Kansas City, I'm convinced that you deserve to hear something positive and encouraging. The growth of this show depends on word of mouth. If you're a regular listener, would you take a moment and copy the link to this show and send it to a cop who might like to or need to hear something positive and helpful? You guys are the reason that we have listeners in all 50 states and over 130 countries. Today we are talking about critical incident debriefs. I had an officer walk into a debrief one time, take one look at the chairs, and say, "This is a circle meeting. I hate circle meetings." Well, typically a modern, well-run debrief will prove its value by the end of the meeting, even reaching most of the skeptics, as long as they go to the meeting in the first place. So our guest today is Major Jamison White from Maryland Heights, Missouri. He's a commander who understands what it's like to be on both sides of the debrief and the critical incident stress that it's meant to help address. He has some encouraging words about how debriefs have developed in recent years, and you're going to want to hear what he has to say about this. Here's Major Jamison White. Hello, Major. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I am so glad to get to talk to you. We have an interesting topic talking about debriefs today, and I felt like you had a lot to share about that. But let's start with kind of who you are. What's been your law enforcement experience?
Sure. Yeah, I've been a policeman for 28 years. I currently work at the Maryland Heights, Missouri Police Department, which is an 85-man agency. I am the deputy chief for that agency, the number 2 in charge here. I have done a lot of hats in my career. I've certainly, motorcycle officer, traffic officer. I worked on the road. I've been a supervisor, sergeant, worked straight nights, DWI enforcement, been some time in the Detective Bureau Major Case, which is a unit here in St. Louis where we investigate homicides. So I've had a lot of big experiences, opportunities to see a lot of things in my career, and then kind of worked my way up into support services, internal affairs, done training. We have a variety of different units, specialized units here that I've been in charge of and over the time of my career. So,
are you in St. Louis County?
We are, yes. We're actually located in St. Louis County, right on the edge between St. Charles County and St. Louis County.
Any favorite assignments, anything that you like, hey, this fits me like a glove, I could have done this for 20 years?
I really loved riding a motorcycle. There was nothing more enjoyable on an 80-degree day to be out. You'd like drive around. Can't believe they're paying me to do this, at times. But so that was a lot of fun. I love supervision. I just gravitate towards leadership. That is a real passion of mine. And so that's been a really wonderful experience. And more recently in my career, the wellness peer support aspect of the law enforcement profession that's become, a bigger topic as of the last probably, I'd say 5 to 10 years.
That's how you were recommended to me, was that you don't understand this major. He gets it. He actually understands officer wellness in a way that a lot of commanders don't.
That stemmed from kind of what our conversation today is going to be about, which it started as a result of a critical incident that I was involved in. And that was where my interest began. And that's where I started reading articles, buying books, because I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to understand more about critical incident stress, which then parlayed into naturally understanding officer wellness, and kind of some of the things that I'd seen going on around me. When I was a younger policeman and still working traffic many years ago, I received a call for a subject on a school parking lot with a gun. And at the time we were getting different calls coming in that was kind of vague or wasn't really explaining everything perfectly. So to make a long story short, a student had brought a rifle to school. It was at the end of the day. There were a lot of individuals in the rear of the school that were doing boarding activities. A lot of people just kind of milling around. And this individual was on the front of the lot. So when I arrived, I was one of the first officers on scene. The young man was clearly having a mental health crisis and had fired off some rounds. A number of officers arrived, and we got in a position to ultimately, he pointed the gun at some officers, and one of the officers shot a couple of times and hit him in the leg, and the subject went down. We were able to approach them and get him into custody, get him some treatment, and ultimately the young man survived. That was my first time of being put in a position that I might have to take another human being's life.
And a minor at that.
And a minor.
Yeah.
Not recognizing it, it probably was a minor, just looking at them from where I was at. Sure.
Yeah. Am I going to have to shoot a kid?
Maybe so, and then all of those things begin to flash before your eyes, the newspaper article, and all of that stuff. And so you're processing something that's very significant, something that's very impactful that you hadn't prepared yourself for during that shift or that day. And the community I worked in was a pretty quiet bedroom type community. So it wasn't something of normal, not that would be a normal call you experience anywhere.
When you were on scene, that kid had fired off rounds. You're one of the first responding officers. Did you draw down on that kid?
I did. I made some very significant decisions in some very quick moments of my career. And I did some things that, looking back on, I'm not patting myself on the back, were some very brave things to put myself in a position to get to his vehicle, to turn his car off so he couldn't get back to the car, to secure the car. He had other weapons in the vehicle, things that we didn't really know what was going on. So I just did some things without my own safety in mind. And it was almost reactionary. It wasn't like I was, you hear soldiers talk about that or things. I wasn't doing this to be the brave guy or to get an award or something. I just did it out of reaction to save other people.
May not hit you till later.
Exactly. And it was about protecting the people that were behind me, because I knew there's a whole lot of people behind me that had no idea what's going on. And so, I as I moved up and got closer, and then, I had my rifle with me, and I got a position behind his vehicle, and he was about maybe 40, 50 feet away from me, but he was facing away. So if I'd taken a shot, I would have been shooting him in the back. And like you said earlier, you kind of have that flash, that moment where you're thinking, gosh, am I going to be in the paper? I shoot some kid in the back. What's that going to look like? And that's all happening in milliseconds, all of those types of things. Yep. So, but it was the first moment that I, in that actual second there, that I realized, if he turns around and points that gun at me, I'm going to have to take his life.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to go home today. It wasn't personal or anything like that, but I knew in that moment I was going to have to do that. And I never did, fortunately. And somebody else took a shot, and that's when we were able to run up. And that was another moment when they shot him. He fell down. I immediately put my sling on the gun and ran up there and kind of got in a position to put some handcuffs on him. And looking back on it, it was one of those moments. There's no cover. The gun was right there next to him. He certainly could have picked it up, but I reacted, and what I felt was the right thing to do in that moment. And again, when I look back at those things, it wasn't that I was trying to be brave. I was just trying to do the thing that I felt was the right reaction. And so you begin to kind of process those things. And I never second guessed what I did in that particular moment, but I know others did around me. And that was where things began to get complicated.
You said you didn't second guess, but I could imagine being very thankful that I didn't give in to sympathetic fire.
Yes.
Because it wasn't necessary. It turned out as well as it could have turned out.
Yes.
But I fear that my instinct would have been, as soon as we're shooting, I would shoot too, whether it needed it or not.
It's interesting you say that, because it kind of turned into, we had no other sympathetic fire or anything, because the one supervisor that ended up shooting didn't, it didn't cause any other, spur up any other issues or incidents at that time. But for myself, kind of thinking about how I responded, I felt my response was good.
Yes.
But it kind of, as we moved on through the situation, obviously there's going to be reviews and people are going to kind of look at it with a microscope, and then there's going to be questions, so those questions had to be answered. And I think at the time I'd probably been a policeman maybe 6 or 7 years. When you hear about critical stress and when you kind of learn more about what that can do to a person, if you don't really understand it, it can make you feel out of sorts. It can certainly make you feel like, for lack of better terms, like you're going crazy. or you can make you feel like you're out of control. And I know as police officers, we like to have control over things. We're kind of control freaks. When you can't control those things and you don't realize or understand, why am I going through this? Is there something wrong with me?
Yeah. It's not just nightmares. There's so many other things that you could excuse as well. I didn't eat well or something like that. And it's actually a stress reaction. And,
100%.
and it gets dismissed and pushed aside repeatedly.
And we know how adrenaline is, too. And that's the one thing, when you get an adrenaline dump, it does some really crazy stuff to your body, and it can last for days and days before finally the cortisol and whatnot gets kind of processed out of your body. So you could experience, in a moment when you're not in any kind of stress, having an adrenaline type dump or having heart racing or any number of those things, So I was experiencing some of those types of physiological and a little bit emotional issues with it.
Sure. All right, let's talk about the debrief. So they did a critical incident debrief for you guys for that incident.
They did. And, interesting, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And my department, that particular department, mandated that we attend. So we attended a debrief. We had a mental health professional that ran the meeting. Clergy member was there, and then a peer support police officer was there as well. And then we kind of began to go through what is the International Critical Stress Foundation's model for debriefing. I didn't know that at the time. I know that now in my role, and which is kind of a seamless process, a 7-step process that's kind of, we walk through that you wouldn't know is going on if you're sitting in the debrief. And I began to learn things at that moment about what I was experiencing. And it was almost like someone peeled back the curtain and let me see behind the magician's tricks, so that I began to hear things. And I'm like, man, how do they know I'm experiencing that? How do they know that I'm having trouble sleeping, or that I'm seeing this incident replay in my head over and over again, and that I have no control over, that I can't stop? When I close my eyes, it just happens, So it was fascinating to me. I thought, gosh, how does the first time that I've ever heard this information as a police officer dealing with critical incidents, and more interestingly enough, that I'd not experienced anything up to that point in my career that caused this much stress for me. So those were both kind of moments where I'm like, man, and I'd been a part of some critical things before, but this was the one that really kind of struck me in that moment. And I do still think it was that thinking about, I might have to take this person's life, or if I'm put in that position, I'm going to have to.
Your view of debriefs changed in that first debrief.
I walked in there with this kind of attitude about, boy, this is going to be a waste of my time. We've all talked about this already. We've already done all of our tactical debriefs on this. The department's run through this thing with a fine-tooth comb. And I just figured, well, I'm not going to hear anything new. That was really what I guess probably the best way to describe that is walking into that meeting going, they're not going to teach me nothing. I already know everything that I know about this incident. I'm a policeman. You can't tell me, who's going to dare tell me how to do my job or how to do it better. And then I sit there and I get kind of slapped upside the head going, hey, dude, you don't know everything. You don't really understand why you're responding the way you are physiologically, psychologically. But I'm going to explain it to you, And so it was such an eye opener, such an epiphany to me to all of a sudden be like, wow, this is something that I didn't know existed. And it was something that really resonated with me, and I've held on to since the rest of my career. So I initially started to get books, started to read articles about critical incident stress and trying to figure out why our bodies react the way that they do. And some were about first responders, some were about military, but just trying to get a general idea of what that was about. And then that kind of parlayed into later in my career, when I became a detective, we began to investigate more serious crimes, including officer-involved shootings. Well, as we know, for critical incidents, there's hardly anything more critical in a police officer's career than maybe a line of duty death or an officer-involved shooting.
Yeah.
And so I began to see other officers' reactions to these incidents from the investigative side. And I had one particular incident that I remember specifically speaking with and interviewing an officer who had been involved in a shooting, who was struggling significantly with that shooting and had all of these signs that I'm seeing. And I'm like, gosh, man, this person needs some serious assistance right now. And for me, it's about taking care of our own. And it's about, I got into this because it's my way of giving back to my people, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so in that case, I made some phone calls to some folks that did the debrief for me, several years before. And that parlayed into me being asked if I wanted to join the team because I had such a knowledge of it and interest in it, which kind of scared me, frankly. I was a detective at the time. I didn't feel like I was the crusty policeman that should probably be the one telling the crusty policeman how to deal with stress and critical incidents. And I joined the team scared out of my mind, kind of just not really knowing. And I know you've been through this yourself, going to that first debrief.
A huge amount of imposter syndrome,
Sure.
Especially where I'm the outsider. And so you have the clinician who's running the meeting typically, and then I'm often kind of this auxiliary person who's sitting in, listening, not necessarily contributing anything. Sometimes I'm the designated person. If someone has to leave the room to go to the restroom, I'm the designated person to go with them, but I very much, man, I do not belong here. And I actually have a lot to contribute, but the meeting itself is so personal. And they're not all that personal, but they can become very personal, very emotional, and it's an important thing. I love doing it, but it was hard to feel like I belonged there at first. This for the first several meetings, and then I've done dozens and dozens of them now. But yeah,
it get easier. But the irony to that is, I felt the same way.
Yeah.
I really did, even though these are my peers. I'm a young policeman. I didn't feel like I was the guy that should be the one in the room. Ironic, and the person that ran the team saw something in me that did resonate with them. And maybe it's just genuineness. Maybe it is a compassion that others don't have, or an understanding of what we were talking about. But again, the meetings aren't about us. They're about the officers that are there and their stories with each other. I share very little in the meeting. Yeah. I share support. I share silver linings at times, but you're right. They can get very deep, very personal. But just being there alone, as we know in the process, having clergy, having a mental health provider, having a peer support, whether it's fire or EMS or just dispatch or communicator, is so important part of that process. One of the things that we discuss in the debriefs that's so important is about what people are experiencing, the heightened emotions, the sleeplessness, the irritability, anger, sometimes closing out family and friends, disruption of your normal routines. We've talked about the adrenaline dumps, the gastrointestinal issues, your changes in concentration, things that you don't, maybe even at a very minor level, you may not realize you're experiencing. But the good thing about the debrief is then you're getting to get some information shared with you about how to address some of those issues. So when you get an opportunity to get in there, hear the whole story, all the pieces of the puzzle put together, because there's going to be things that you're not familiar with. Yeah. In some situations, if it's a more of a one-on-one type scenario, but if it's something that's got multiple people, communicators involved, firefighters or whatnot, hearing every bit of the puzzle many times fills in the blank spaces. And then filling in those blank spaces is another element of this process that works so well. I can remember one many years ago where the PD was so mad at the fire department because they weren't getting to the scene fast enough. And they're like, where are these guys? Where are these guys? Well, the PD had blocked the road up with all their cars and the fire department couldn't get there. So they had to bring this stretcher a half mile down the road to get to these guys. And so when the PD heard about that, the officers were like, you could see them all deflate, like, oh gosh, we were the buttheads that caused this delay. Like it was because there's an officer involved shooting where the officer got injured and shot. And so there was that frustration. But in that moment, if we had never had that conversation, that would have always been there as a piece of anxiety or angst or something that had caused issues between those two entities. So you kind of start solving those.
I've seen the same thing with officers and dispatchers in the same debrief, where the dispatcher starts telling the story from their point of view, and you can look around the room and watch the officers, the light bulb goes on. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about it from your point of view. and whatever criticisms they had or whatever, just go away. It's like, oh, I hadn't considered it from your point of view.
And one thing we do, which first responders do this so much, is we second guess ourselves. And we just absolutely second guess ourselves. So the nice part about that so many times is when an officer in that same situation, and I see this almost in every debrief, when another officer says, hey, this is what happened. This was the particular situation, and your angle on that gun, or the angle on that particular window, or whatever it might have been. If you hadn't been there, this other thing might have happened, or somebody else might have got hurt, or you saved that person's life. And that other officer, because they're so worried about second guessing what they were doing, that they don't realize, and that fills that piece of that puzzle in, a little bit of that anxiety associated with, did I do the right thing, or was I in the right spot, or was my reaction time the best? Every
time I've seen an officer or a firefighter, EMS, anybody really express, I'm not sure if I did the right thing, and they say that out loud in those meetings, they almost are always surrounded by, you did everything, you did the right thing, no one here blames you. And hearing that out loud, I think, is a big psychological and spiritual thing that we need. And so, because some officers never get that because they don't have these meetings, they kind of that just eats at them like a cancer in their soul. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's one of the most beautiful things about these meetings is that there can be this cross like affirmation and reassurance. And I think that's a really valuable thing.
I wanted to talk briefly about somebody that had a substance abuse issue who experienced a critical incident and then went through a debrief, and then later got clean, and they had alcohol issues, and then experienced a critical incident and then went through another debrief. And that individual shared with us in the second debrief that they were really concerned after the first incident, because at the time they were an alcoholic, that they would potentially maybe go back to the abuses of alcohol that they were doing prior to the to getting clean, and then prior to this other critical incident. So they were really thinking about this a lot, that, gosh, if I have to go through what I went through the last time, I'm going to fall back to my bad habits because of how stressful that last incident was. And after they got clean and this other incident that happened, which was equally as horrible as the first, he told us during the debrief, which I thought was huge, that after being sober, his body was able to process the stress associated with that second critical incident so much better that he didn't even have a thought about going back to the alcohol. He didn't even have a moment, because he understood, one, what he's experiencing from the critical stress side of it, because he'd already been shared with him, but he also realized that wasn't going to be the trigger to send him back. And it was such a huge relief to him at the time when he shared that story that he actually was crying because he was so afraid in that moment, because he still wanted to be a policeman so bad, but that was his big angry fear, or his big fear in that moment. So I just wanted to share that's something that if you're experiencing substance abuse issues, or you're having some issues in that realm, you can get past that, and you can get it past it with critical incidents and stress management debriefs too.
Let me ask you, how many debriefs do you think you've done? Just ballpark figure.
It's hard because I lost track many years ago. I know it's somewhere between 50 and 100.
Dozens and dozens and dozens. Yeah,
because you literally do. I've been doing it for 16 years. Probably do 10 a year at least. Something roughly.
You may be well north of 100.
Maybe but the irony to that is that you is the variety. You've done enough now too that there's never one that's the same. There's never one that's alike. Now, the individuals in there sometimes can be similar. You might have the old crusty policeman who's in the corner with his arms folded, chairs back against the wall. Clearly doesn't want to say anything. Clearly he's kind of got his head down, doesn't want to be there. But many times I find those are the ones that share some of the most valuable information once we kind of break through that particular barrier with them, and kind of build the trust within the debrief itself.
It's funny. A lot of times these debriefs are they're capped at 60 minutes or 90 minutes or something like that. And it's funny, if it's a 60-minute meeting, it'll be about 55 minutes in where the old crusty guy realizes, you know what, I need to participate in this. And then they open up with 5 minutes left.
But want to tell every story
I know, and that's so good.
But what's interesting is getting those individuals to be a part of the team. So if you're that officer who says this is a waste of my time, like I was, and you're going to walk in there and not share, but you're the guy that's the senior officer in that room, you need to be the one to share, just to show the younger officers that it's okay to be that person. It's okay. Yeah. And I've seen this happen in numerous meetings where once that person starts to share, everybody else kind of breaks down, and then they're more open, and then the meetings are so much better. They're more productive, and there's so much more sharing. But that officer will many times say, man, I wish that I had this 20 years ago when I started this career, because I've been through 100 of these, and no one ever gave me this kind of help, So, and of course, officers fall into the holes of depression and substance abuse and those other issues to try to figure these things out on their own. Not that a debrief is going to keep you from going down those paths, but it certainly can give you the pieces to process maybe that one individual situation, and then maybe the next one, because you've been through it. You can say, I remember they told me I might experience X, Y, Z during these types of situations. You can go back to that and pull from that and remind yourself that, hey, I'm not going crazy here.
All right, let me ask you some rapid fire questions. You can give me some short answers in response. Who should go to the debrief? How wide a net do you cast?
We always use the pebble in the pond theory. So when the pebble hits the pond and the ripples kind of go out, you really want those folks in that first ripple or two. You don't need the guy that's blocking traffic a mile away. You don't need the officer that responded 20 minutes later. You really need that initial response, whether that's a paramedic, whether that's fire, EMS on the scene, those officers that had to go into the burning building and pull the bodies out, or try to drag the kid out of the burning car while they're screaming, and trapped. So you want those people that are right there, the ones that are the sights, the sounds, smells, they're immersed in that incident. You really, and it's not that it's a waste of time, but you're really bogging down the process if you start to get individuals in there that say, well, I'm on B squad, but I wasn't working that day. I was on my day off, but I'm here to support B squad. Well, I get that and appreciate that. And you can support those team members, but doing it outside of the debrief, because that's not what that's really designed for. And
that leads to the next question: is how big is too big?
Too big is when you start to include supervisors that were not involved. When you start to include command staff that wasn't around, you get more than 15, 20 people. That begins to start turning into something that's more called a diffusing than a debrief. You're not going to have the time to get around that circle. If you walk in a room and there's 50 people in there, that's not going to be a quality debrief.
Specifically because it would take too long to get into depth?
Yes, because you really want to get everybody to try to share. And that's another key to this, something I was going to...
And you don't want a 3-hour debrief.
Because people will get not uninterested, but it's exhausting, honestly. Yep. It can be very exhausting, especially for somebody who's very close to the incident that is having an emotional reaction. You're dragging them through this, kind of bringing all of that emotion back up. And you do that for 3 hours, somebody's going to fall out on you. You're really going to have some issues. So you have to find that. And it may just mean that you break it up. You might do a couple different segments. If all those people were truly involved in, I can think of an active shooter situation, you're probably going to have a lot of officers involved in that scenario. So you're probably going to want to try to do multiple debriefs.
Okay. Pros and cons of mandatory versus voluntary. Should it be mandatory?
In my opinion, yes. And the reason for that is that you're going to get that person that would never go in a million years go and get some value out of it. Also, we have the big thing about mandatory to me is if you have a command staff that supports the process and you have people that you've got a department that has a good wellness and peer support program, you're probably going to get officers to go because they're going to feel more support from the agency and the command staff. But if you don't have that and it becomes or you have a supervisor on that platoon that says, oh, that's a waste of time, you don't want to go to that. And I've got stories about those guys in debriefs that can really ruin the process or somebody. So if you're an officer and you get asked to go to a debrief, I highly recommend you go. You're going to hear something. You're going to experience something. You're going to get to see parts of that situation that maybe you didn't see from that angle. And if nothing else, you might help somebody in that room that needs more help than you do.
That came very close to my last question. What is your elevator pitch for the officer who it's not mandatory? He was directly involved in a pretty severe situation, but it's not. But he has the option. What's your elevator pitch? Please go to this meeting.
We are all rough and tough, and we think we know everything as police officers, and nobody's going to tell me how to do my job. And I've seen it all kind of mentality about things. But I can promise you, and I can tell you that the number of debriefs that I've sat through, that even though everybody experiences the critical incident differently, so you may not be experiencing any kind of critical incident stress associated with that incident, but that person sitting next to you, your teammate, your platoon mate, the officer that's your best friend, may be going through something very difficult with that situation, and he's afraid to even share it with you. So your part of being there to support them is huge. And then talking about what you're experiencing and talking about what you saw in that moment. So if it's about anything else, it's about protecting those policemen that were there, the policemen that work with you every day.
Major White, thank you so much for what you do and what you've been doing for several years now. It really is a kind of the secret sauce to officer wellness, and it makes a big impact. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and absolutely love talking about this stuff. So if you ever need to do it again, I would love to be a part of that.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to thank Major Jamison White for coming on the show. I appreciate him, especially because I had a gap in my production schedule, and he was willing to adjust his schedule and record from his office to help me out. I also have some bonus material from Major White for you. He wanted to share some practical tips on handling critical incident stress that might be done before or after a debrief. Here's that material.
So I just wanted to share, part of the debrief process is we share information about how to process and deal with the critical incident stress. So there's a variety of things that you can do. Some of these are very common sense. Some of them, you might not think of them in the same vein, but once you're experiencing critical stress, you might want to look at it from this particular perspective. So maintaining a routine, continuing your normal eating and sleeping, practice breathing. If you're somebody that believes in like four-corner type breathing, make sure you're doing those things. Be active, exercise. Don't close out your family or friends, your coworkers. Talk about the incident. Don't be afraid to share. That's a great way to process things. Use your department's resources, peer support, EAP, your wellness teams. They're there for a reason. Counselors, you name it. Avoid the bad things, the caffeines, the nicotines, the alcohol, the prescription medications. I understand, that people are going to do those things. I'm not saying you can't do them, but I said you need to be responsible about it. Don't turn into the case of beer guy when you maybe you might have 2 or 3 a night. Now you're drinking a case of beer every night. You got to be very careful, because what you're doing is masking your body's ability to recover from this incident, and you're putting a Band-Aid on something that's going to prolong your ability to recover faster.
And please let me reiterate one more time that the key takeaway from all of this is that if you have gone through a critical incident and your agency does not make it mandatory for you to go to a debrief, but it's optional, please choose to go to the debrief. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain. Do you think that their efforts pay off a percentage of the time? Do you think that a chief or a sheriff gets one of these letters and shuts down his chaplain program without investigating further? Do you think that happens?
Absolutely. I don't think it happens. I know it happens, because I've got contacts from chaplaincies that city councils and county boards, mayors, local officials, sometimes chiefs and sheriffs, although chiefs and sheriffs are a little bit different fabric. They're more willing to, stand and fight. They've got the warrior mentality. You come after us, we're coming back. But the other officials who really run the town, who really run the city, the county, they're the ones usually that they read the letter. It says, if you do not cease and desist and disband this chaplaincy program, we will bring lawsuit against your community, city, county, state. Cease and desist immediately, or we will bring lawsuit against you. Each time that I've been named and or a part of those lawsuits, they've been dropped.
The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. Everything we talked about today was meant for informational purposes and should not be construed to be medical advice. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, let's pray for peace in our city. Tell me, I just lost it. Got so busy talking about myself. Yeah, man, it's my favorite topic.
I'll share something and then you'll probably remember.
You go right ahead. I'm looking through my notes, but you go right ahead.